Imagine fighting a war for 30 years alone. No orders. No reinforcements. No surrender. Just you, your rifle, and a jungle that became your entire world. While the rest of humanity moved on, rebuilt cities, sent men to the moon, and buried the 20th century's darkest chapter, one man never got the memo. And when they finally found him, what he said left the world completely speechless. Welcome back to Epic Stories, the channel where history stops being a textbook and starts feeling like the most intense movie you've ever watched. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we tell the stories they never taught you in school. World War II officially ended in 1945. Flags were raised. Soldiers came home. The world exhaled. But deep inside the thick, suffocating jungles of the Philippines, one Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda had no idea any of that had happened. And so he kept fighting. For 30 years. Against an enemy that had long since stopped being his enemy. This is one of the most haunting, heartbreaking, and quietly extraordinary stories to ever come out of the Second World War. To understand why Onoda never stopped, you have to understand who he was before the jungle swallowed him whole. Hiroo Onoda was not your average soldier. Born in 1922 in rural Japan, he grew up in a culture where the military was not just a career. It was a calling. A sacred duty. From childhood, he was shaped by one belief above all others. A Japanese soldier does not surrender. Ever. That idea was not a suggestion. It was woven into his bones. By the time he was in his early 20s, Onoda had been trained as an intelligence officer, one of the most elite and psychologically demanding roles in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines in December 1944 with a very specific mission. Disrupt enemy supply lines, gather intelligence, and resist any Allied advance for as long as necessary. His commanding officer gave him orders that would echo through the next 3 decades of his life. He was told, under no circumstances, was he to surrender or take his own life. He was to fight until he received direct orders to stand down. That was it. No exceptions. When Allied forces overwhelmed Lubang Island in early 1945, most Japanese soldiers were either killed or captured. But Onoda and a small group of men disappeared into the jungle. They were not retreating. In their minds they were regrouping, waiting for orders that would never come. Then on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. But nobody told the jungle. Onoda and his small band of soldiers heard rumors. They found leaflets dropped from planes that read, "The war has ended. Come out." They found newspapers left at the edges of the jungle with headlines screaming about Japan's defeat. But here is what makes this story so much more than just a tale of stubbornness. Onoda did not ignore those signs out of stupidity. He ignored them out of training. He had been specifically prepared to resist enemy propaganda. And in his mind, every leaflet, every newspaper, every message was exactly that. A trick. A psychological operation designed to lure loyal soldiers out of hiding. So he stayed. And he fought. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Onoda and his dwindling group of comrades carried out guerrilla operations against Filipino civilians and police. They raided farms for food. They destroyed rice supplies. They ambushed patrols. To the outside world, they were a ghost story. A rumor. To the people of Lubang Island, they were a very real and ongoing nightmare. By some estimates, Onoda's unit was responsible for the deaths of around 30 people during those decades in the jungle. That number sits heavy because every single one of those deaths happened after the war had already ended. One by one, his companions fell away. One surrendered in 1950. Another was shot and killed in 1954. His last remaining companion was killed in a firefight in 1972. And then there was one. Just Onoda. Alone in the jungle. Still fighting a war that the entire world had long since moved on from. Before we go further, if this story is already getting to you the way it gets to me every time I revisit it, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history told the right way. Subscribe if you haven't yet and drop a comment below. I want to know, if you were Onoda, would you have done the same thing? Let's keep going. Now here is where the story takes a turn that almost feels like it belongs in a film. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided he was going to travel the world searching for 3 things: Hiroo Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. In that order. Most people laughed at him. Nobody had found Onoda in nearly 3 decades. Search parties had come and gone. His own family had visited the island and called out for him through loudspeakers. Nothing. But Suzuki went into that jungle anyway. And incredibly, he found him. When the two men met, Onoda did not lower his weapon. He was lean, weathered, and alert, a man who had spent 30 years surviving on instinct. But he listened. Suzuki told him the war was over, that Japan had surrendered in 1945, that the world had changed beyond recognition. Onoda heard him, and then he said something that stopped Suzuki cold. He said he could not stand down. Not without orders from a superior officer. That was his duty, and duty was everything. Suzuki went back to Japan and reported what he had found. The Japanese government tracked down Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was by then living a quiet life as a bookstore owner. Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang Island. And on March 9, 1974, in a moment that is almost impossible to fully process, Major Taniguchi stood before Hiroo Onoda in that jungle and formally relieved him of his duties. The mission was over. The war was over. It had been over for nearly 30 years. Onoda stood at attention. He laid down his rifle, his ammunition, his sword, and the dagger his mother had given him years before to take his own life rather than surrender. He handed over every piece of his war. And then, for the first time in 3 decades, he walked out of the jungle. He was 52 years old. The images of that moment traveled around the world. Here was a man emerging from the trees in a perfectly maintained uniform, still physically sharp, still carrying himself with the posture of a soldier. The world did not know whether to call him a hero, a tragedy, or something else entirely. The Philippine government initially pressed charges against him for the deaths that had occurred during his jungle campaign. But under pressure, Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon. Onoda returned to Japan as a national curiosity, a man out of time, a living relic of a war the country had spent decades trying to forget. But Japan felt strange to him. The country he had sacrificed everything for was unrecognizable. The values he had fought to preserve seemed to have dissolved into a modern Western-influenced society he could not connect with. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he ran a cattle ranch for years. He later returned to Japan, started a nature school for young people, and spent the rest of his life teaching survival and self-discipline. He died in January 2014 at the age of 91. Here is what stays with me about Hiroo Onoda. He was not a madman. He was not broken in the way we might assume. He was, in the most profound and unsettling sense, exactly what his country made him to be. A man of absolute loyalty. A man who followed his orders to the literal end of the world. The tragedy is not that he was weak. The tragedy is that he was so completely, so perfectly devoted to a cause that had already collapsed without him. When asked whether he regretted those 30 years, Onoda said he did not. He had done what he believed was right. He had done his duty. And in that answer, there is something that haunts you long after the story ends. Because it forces you to ask yourself, what beliefs do we hold so tightly that no amount of evidence could ever shake them loose? That is the story of Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier of the Second World War. A man who fought alone in the dark, not out of madness but out of faith. A faith so absolute it outlasted the very war it was born from. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves history. Leave a comment telling me what you think about Onoda because this one always sparks a debate. Subscribe to Epic Stories if you are not already part of this community, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Every week we bring you the most powerful, untold, and unforgettable moments from human history. And trust me, the stories we have coming are ones you do not want to miss. See you in the next one.